Okay, so this is our Merleau Ponty reading group. We're continuing our reading of the structure of behavior from page 104 of the translation. We skipped last week. We're picking up again from this week. I'm just trying to remember what exactly we talked about last time, but I think it was more the last session was more of like a summary, I think, of some of the material that we saw uh, in the last few sessions. So it's generally the idea that when we're trying to account for behavior, this complex adaptive behavior that we observe in organisms going about their lives, finding food, finding mates, avoiding predators, all this stuff. We we have to avoid first the very simple reflex theory that he's criticized throughout the parts that we've read, and then also the parts that we skipped. So this idea that you could sort of build up this complex adaptive behavior out of very simple stimulus response pairs. But then more like a somewhat more sophisticated theory that would sort of interpose a processing step in between the stimulus and the response. So there would be some sort of atomic stimulus, and then like maybe a comparison of a few different stimuli with each other, or some sort of processing that happens of these stimuli in the brain, and then some sort of output or response as a result of that processing. And so this sort of processing theory, or this like intermediary theory, seems sort of like a natural alternative to the reflex theory. Like it seems like if you oppose the reflex theory, then you must posit some sort of intermediate or processing step in the whole process. But what Merleau-Ponty wants us to do instead is to sort of reconceive of the whole interaction between an organism and its environment. And in particular, he wants us to see the sort of initial uptake of some element of the environment in this sort of holistic dynamic sense, as opposed to this static and atomic sense that is shared by the reflex theory and this more sophisticated processing theory. So the idea here is that there's never any part of the processing, of the whole relationship of the organism and its environment that consists of an atomic self-contained sensation that only secondarily gets sort of connected to other sensations or other atomic elements of the mind that are processed and compared with each other and so on. So he wants us to. He uses this term melodic perception, or a few other different terms like that. But it's this idea that we have this sort of grasp of an articulated structure as such. So we grasp something structured like a melody, not first by receiving these structureless parts and then connecting those parts to each other, but we grasp the structure as such. And so this requires a certain shift of our sort of perception of what the perceptual situation consists in, and eventually it's going to lead to maybe a more sort of far-reaching reconception of what the relationship is between the world and knowledge. And we'll see more on that like towards the end of the book. But it at least we can already see here that it sort of reshapes what we might mean by like objective and subjective. It's not the case, or if we allow for something like this melodic perception, or this grasp of a structured whole as such, then it can't be the case that the object outside the organism and then the organism itself are like sort of two separate entities that come into contact, and then perception is a result of that contact. We instead have to have some sort of dynamic relationship between the organism and its environment, and the capacity of the organism to pick out some element or aspect of the environment and grasp it as a structured whole. So it's a more, I guess, interactive and dynamic conception of how organisms relate to their environment, as opposed to a kind of external and static conception of these two sort of separate entities that sometimes come into contact with each other. And so like again, this is something we'll see more of later in the book, but he's already sort of pointed out that in scientific observation, we have the same kind of problem. Like if we treat the scientific observer as something sort of separate and outside the object of study, so like an animal in a laboratory, for example, then we're still stuck with this kind of it sort of naturally leads us towards this behaviorist conception of animal psychology, or of what the relationship is between the experimenter and the object of study. So like the sort of picture of what the task of the experimenter is in this view is that the experimenter observes an animal, performing certain behaviors, pressing a lever or navigating a maze or whatever, and then has to sort of infer what processes are going on behind the scenes inside the animal's brain, or whatever exactly form of explanation the experimenter wants to use. But instead, what Merleau-Ponty wants us to, or what he sort of points towards, he doesn't give like a sort of extensive account of this at this point, but like he's pointing towards the idea that this sort of grasp of structured wholes that is part of our perceptual capacity is something that we bring to bear on scientific problems as well. So when we see the rat navigating a maze, for example, we can see the rat, trying to reach a goal, for example, trying to find food, whatever the task is exactly. So we use our capacities as living beings, as beings that are capable of grasping structured wholes, as part of our scientific understanding of the behavior of organisms that we observe, and trying to sort of pretend otherwise, that we can sort of detach ourselves from that perception is not actually more scientific in the way that we might think it is. It's actually sort of artificially presupposing a certain structure of scientific explanation and imposing that on a situation. So yeah, we need to instead allow for a more sort of naturalistic description of behavior. So like we don't sort of deny ourselves the vocabulary of recognizing an animal's intentions or goals, or what it's trying to do, and so on. We sort of allow ourselves to use this kind of language because we recognize that in using that kind of language, we are expressing the capacity that we have to grasp the animal's behavior as a structured whole. So this whole sort of account of perception and behavior that applies to the animals in the laboratory setting also applies to us as the observers of that laboratory setting. So it's a kind of reflexive account. Okay, so right, and then he maybe the last bit here is the so he just introduced, we just got to this last bit in the last session about these sort of categories to classify behavior. He's going to, he just introduced these terms, but he's going to go through them in order in the next few sections that we'll get to today. So he's going to talk about syncretic forms, immovable forms, and symbolic forms. So these would be like three different sort of categories of behavior in relation to the extent to which, or the relation of this behavior and perception to concrete spatiotemporal context. So like just in a sort of big picture, obviously human thought and language and so on can be sort of detached from a concrete situation. You can, like, I can talk about the Eiffel Tower, even though I've never been there. I can, describe ancient Egypt or whatever, a time that obviously none of us have ever experienced. Whereas other animals, their sort of grasp of the world is always tied to a specific spatiotemporal context. They're interested in this piece of food and not like the nature of food in general or something like that. So yeah, these are like sort of different, I guess, extremes on a continuum of like how perception and behavior can be either tied to a particular context or can sort of separate themselves from that context. And so we're going to see like three stages along that continuum, or three different forms of that relationship as we go through these different categories. Okay, so if someone can pick up from page 104 at the heading, the syncretic forms.
I just wanted to give really quick an example. We were talking about understanding behavior on the basis of our own understanding of structured situations. Somebody sent me this article and video about this guy who's a ornithologist and evolutionary biologist, who argues for the importance of, in some cases, something like subjective aesthetic preference in sexual selection in birds and other animals. And, in these cases where another example he gives is bees, which in some cases seem to have preferences, like aesthetic preferences for different kinds of flowers, which are not reducible to things like so-called honest advertisement, signaling of genetics. I don't know, this is maybe an interesting example of one of the ways in which we can understand animal behavior if we allow ourselves to see animals as, having this first-person structured perceptual experience, including, in some cases, aesthetic experiences and aesthetic preferences. It's pretty cool talk in that link that I shared.
Yeah, I'll check that out. Yeah, I haven't seen that exact discussion, but yeah, it reminds me also of Konrad Lorenz, who was one of the sort of early practitioners of ethology in the first half of the 20th century. He in one of his books, he talks about geese being in love, and he sort of defends using this concept of love, which in some sense might be, anthropomorphic. Obviously, we don't know what a goose like internal life is like, what it's like to be a goose in a lifelong mating relationship with another goose. But he defends the use of this term as appropriate in that these birds, if you sort of just describe them naturalistically, you don't sort of deny yourself the capacity to grasp their behavior. You can see that they're obviously very attached to each other, that like if one of them dies, the other one is very strongly affected, and so on. Using language like love in some sense is anthropomorphic, but not using that language is not necessarily more scientific just because it's like sort of more restrictive. So like we always have to use human categories to understand animal behavior no matter what we do. And so there's no sort of a priori superiority of denying the use of emotional language or aesthetic language or whatever in terms of like scientific rigor.
I can read from, I think we're at syncretic forms.
Yes. Yeah, thanks.
Syncretic forms. At this level, behavior is tied either to certain abstract aspects of the situations or to certain complexes of very special stimuli. In any case, it is imprisoned in the framework of its natural conditions and treats unexpected situations only as allusions to the vital situations which are prescribed for it. The simplest forms of behavior, those, for example, that are found in invertebrates, are never addressed to isolated objects and always depend upon a large number of external conditions. An ant placed on a stick allows itself to fall on a white paper marked with a black circle only if the sheet of paper is of definite dimensions, if the distance from the ground and the inclination of the stick have a definite value, and finally, if there is a definite intensity and direction of the light. This complex of conditions corresponds to the natural situations which release the quote-unquote instinctive acts of the animal. The training which can be achieved with the starfish scarcely goes beyond the framework of the situations in which the animal finds itself in its natural life. Even when learning is possible, it does not take into account the details of the experimental apparatus. It is a global response addressed to vital situations which are somewhat analogous. If one attempts to establish conditioned reflexes in a toad, one realizes that the responses of the animal depend on the resemblance which can exist between experimental situations and those for which it possesses instinctual equipment, much more than on the associations and dissociations achieved by the experimenter. If an earthworm is placed in front of a toad but separated from it by a glass, the animal perseveres in its attempts at prehension, in spite of the failures which ought to be inhibiting, because in natural life, the instinctual equipment prescribes repeated attempts when confronted with a mobile objective. On the other hand, if an ant which tastes bad is presented to the animal, this unique experience is sufficient to provoke an inhibition with regard to all other ants, because in the natural condition, the instinctual equipment assures a general halting of positive reactions, which reaction with regard to all the ants of a hill when a sample has given rise to reactions of disgust. Finally, if the animal is presented with a little piece of black paper, which is dangled at the end of a thin wire, in which it succeeds in nabbing, this quote-unquote deceptive experience does give rise to inhibition, one which ceases at the end of a few minutes. Thus, we can presume that it depends less on gustative properties of the paper than on the instinctual rhythm which in natural life orders the animal to take new attempts at prehension only if it has not succeeded in nabbing the bait. Thus, it is never to the experimental stimulus that the frog reacts. The stimulus is reflexogenic only to the extent that it resembles one of the dimensionally limited objects of a natural activity. And the reactions which the stimulus evokes are determined not by the physical particularities of the present situation, but by the biological laws of behavior. If one wishes to give a precise meaning to words, behavior of this kind, which responds literally to a complex of stimuli rather than to certain essential traits of the situation, could be called instinctive. The kinds of behavior which are ordinarily called instinctive imply structures which are much less quote-unquote adherent than those we just described. Thus, it is often difficult to distinguish them from quote-unquote intelligent behavior. So when he says that these behaviors are not addressed to isolated objects, it seems like what he's saying here is that the behaviors aren't triggered unless this kind of ensemble of stimuli, which always provoke the instinctual behavior, are all present. It's not like if somehow you could present a toad with an ant or with a worm that wasn't behaving in the way that it instinctually sort of expects the worm to behave, it might not try to eat it.
Yeah, so these are the kinds of behaviors that require this sort of conjunction of many different properties of an object to trigger the behavior. So the worm has to have a certain color, a certain overall shape, a certain sort of pattern of movement. Like all these elements have to be there, otherwise the toad won't sort of recognize this is a worm in front of me, therefore I should eat it. These types of experiments are sometimes difficult to conduct because of this requirement of all these different factors, because it's hard to tell like which factors are actually at work in sort of producing a certain kind of behavior. So like you have to to be able to sort of pin down which perceptual qualities sort of trigger the prehension behavior of the toad. You would have to like produce a whole series of artificial worms that have different colors, different shapes, different patterns of movement, etc., and see which ones the toad actually tries to grasp and which ones it doesn't. Often it's like a very specific, like in say the natural setting of the toad, there might only be like, orange worms of this length that move in this particular way, and the toad might only respond to that particular sort of combination. And then other like slightly different worm types that have like a pinkish color or whatever, it might just ignore completely just because it doesn't fit what it expects a worm to look like. Often these kinds of responses are very specific to like the setting of the organism, that like this toad lives in a particular area where only this specific type of worm is found, and therefore it only responds to the properties that are reliable signs of this particular type of worm. So these kinds of behaviors are in some sense rigid in the sense that they respond to like a very specific type of situation, the presence of a worm or whatever, and also they don't adapt in like flexible ways to the circumstances. So like the example that he gives here is that if you know separate the toad from a worm by a piece of glass or whatever, the toad will just keep trying to catch the worm, even though it's repeatedly failed. So, like, from a sort of behaviorist perspective, the toad should learn that trying to grasp this worm is not working, and there should be like a sort of there should be inhibition of this behavior. But the toad just persists in performing this sort of natural behavior of grasping the worm because it's like very tightly tied with the perception of the worm shape and the grasping behavior. They're like closely connected to each other, and so it's not capable of sort of learning that this behavior is not appropriate to the unnatural condition of having the piece of glass stuck between the worm and itself. These are like the most sort of tied to a particular situation of all these forms of behavior, so that it's a very close link between a particular perceptual pattern and a behavioral response. But the difference here between this and like the classic stimulus response theory is that the perceptual patterns here are like a sort of total pattern of a situation. It's not just perceiving one like a red patch in the visual field or whatever. It's not an atomic sensation. It's a whole structure of worm type visual perception, color, shape, movement, etc. All these things being conjoined in the right way that evokes a particular behavioral response of trying to grasp the worm.
When he says that that these behaviors are not addressed to isolated objects, I assume he doesn't mean that these behaviors can't be understood in terms of like figure and ground distinctions, just that you need the ensemble of conditions present in order for the instinctual behavior to be triggered. I mean, obviously we can't step into the standpoint of the toad, but it seems like the figure ground, that the perceptual situation is characterized by a figure ground structure is important for the argument in the book.
Yeah, I think that's right. Like in the case of the toad, clearly the worm sort of stands out as a figure against the ground of the earth or soil, or whatever that the worm is seen on top of. I think that this idea, this claim that the this type of form doesn't can't be understood in terms of isolated objects. I think the idea here is that we have to understand the response to the worm of the toad's response to the worm is not like it's not isolated from the toad's sort of natural life setting. So if you present the worm in a sort of strange setting with under like different lighting, or I don't know, in a metal cage, for example, without like earth and plants and all these other things around that the toad would normally be in, the toad might not respond in the normal way. It might not recognize the worm as a worm if it finds it in a unnatural setting. So it's not the toad is not just sort of identifying this as a worm in front of me, therefore I'm going to eat it. It's instead sort of responding to a type of situation that it encounters in its natural life. Sitting near a pond, a worm crawls by, and then it goes and grasps it to eat it. This is like a sort of natural situation that the toad encounters, and this is the kind of situation that the toad's behavior responds to, as opposed to like identifying a worm as a sort of isolated object and then deciding like what kinds of behavior to engage in response to identifying this object.
Yeah, that makes sense to me.
Okay. We can go on to the next section, the immovable forms. If someone else would like to read. Okay. Yeah. So I can read this one. We can hopefully get another volunteer for the following one. Okay. The amovable forms. Behavior of the preceding category certainly does include a reference to relations, but they remain involved in the matter of certain concrete situations. This is why they are not available for true learning. As soon as we observe in the history of behavior the appearance of signals which are not determined by the instinctual equipment of the species, we can presume that they are founded on structures which are relatively independent of the materials in which they are realized. In signal behavior, the quote-unquote situation to which the organism adapts is the simple temporal or spatial contiguity of a conditioned and an unconditioned stimulus. But as we indicated above and must now show, signal learning is not a simple transfer of this de facto contiguity into behavior. It must become a contiguity, quote, for the organism, unquote. If spatial contiguity is involved, the unconditioned stimulus is not linked to the conditioned stimulus, which is the object of the training, but to a structure of the ensemble of which it is only a moment, and from which it derives its meaning. This is what is shown by Köhler's well-known experiments. If one accustoms a domestic chicken to choose between two equal piles of grain, the one which is signaled by a light gray, G1, and to leave aside the one which is signaled by a medium gray, G2, and if in the critical experiment, that is, after from 4 to 600 training experiences, one eliminates G2 and introduces a new gray, G0, which is lighter than G1, the subject faced with a reflexogenic color and a neutral color should, it would seem, choose the first. In fact, 4 subjects submitted to this training chose the new neutral color 59 times, while the positive color was chosen only 26 times. A counter-proof is obtained by conserving in the critical experiment not the positive color, but the color to which an inhibition should have been acquired, G2, by presenting it with a new gray darker than it. The negative color is chosen. Thus, the reflexogenic power is not bound up with a certain nuance of gray, but, quote, to the lighter, unquote, of the two. Correlatively, the acquired motor reaction is not a sum of individual movement. During the course of the experiment, care is taken to exchange the relative positions of the lightest and darkest gray in order to avoid any interference of an adaptation to the right and left with the differential reaction to the colors. Thus, the motor responses involve widely variable bundles of muscles and nerves. It is an afferent structure which releases and regulates a motor structure. Thus, the relation of the conditioned stimulus to the conditioned response is a relation between relations. The training does not transpose a de facto contiguity into behavior. The signal is a configuration, sign Gestalt. Tolman comes to the same conclusion concerning temporal contiguity. The white curtain which indicates the, quote, good path, unquote, at the end of which the animal will find its food, would not derive its reflexogenic power from the simple fact that it was always presented to the animal before each favorable experience. It would owe it to the fact that, along with the favorable result, it constitutes a configuration. Tolman seeks to prove this by establishing that the reflexogenic power of the curtain disappears if the animal receives an electric shock when placed directly at the end of the path. The inhibiting value acquired by the end of the path would rebound on the entrance, which would presuppose some internal relation between them. All the same, this counter result has not been observed by Tolman himself, who worked with tired animals, it is true. And the strict behaviorists add that, even if it is produced, it can be explained in terms of conditioned reflexes. The electric shock does, as a matter of fact, cause the white curtain to lose its value as a positive stimulus only when the rat, at the moment when it received the shock, was beginning the prehension and mastication reactions themselves, which take place in the presence of the ghoul. If it is shocked at the moment it is executing reactions to the ghoul, reactions in water, different from those which ordinarily take place in the experimental apparatus, reaction to the food, the influence of the shock on the reflexogenic power of the white curtain is weak. The rat still enters the path marked by a white curtain, but he goes through it more slowly. This influence is the more sensitive as the two goals are more similar. The counter result of the electric shock should then be explained without having recourse to a configuration signal. It is a general law of the conditioned reflex that the acquired reaction tends to be anticipated by the stimuli which precede the conditioned stimulus itself. Animals trained to enter a food box in which they should turn toward the right take and follow the right side of the alley from the moment of their entry into the labyrinth. Likewise, the rat anticipates reactions to the ghoul at the entrance of Tolman's apparatus. Since these latter have become inhibiting as an effect of the electric shock, the animal will not enter the path which it followed before. Thus, it is the reactions to the ghoul and not the structure of the situation which would serve as a vehicle for the acquired inhibition and would cause it to intervene from the moment of entry into the experimental box. To which one could reply, as has already been said, that the attitudes of the rat when it refuses to enter the path marked by the white curtain are not identical with the behavior which was initiated by the electric shock, and that likewise the movements necessary for following the right side of the path are materially different from those which the rat will execute in the presence of the turn. The reflex is not anticipated, it is prepared and preformed. Thus the phenomenon cannot be accounted for by saying that the same movements have been transferred from one stimulus to another prior stimulus. Rather, it should be said that the latter initiates movements which have a meaningful relation to the change of sign of the final stimulus. This retroactive action, which is not a simple displacement in time, would in the final analysis be favorable to the notion of sign Gestalt. The activity of the organism would be literally comparable to a kinetic melody, since any change in the end of the melody qualitatively modifies its beginning and the physiognomy of the whole. It is in the same manner that the closing of an alley in a labyrinth immediately confers a negative value, not only on the entrance to this alley, but on that of a second alley, which, after a detour, falls on this side of the barrier. And this is so even if the animal has not just gone through it. The failure has the effect of changing the sign of all the stimuli which have a determined structural relation to the place where it took place. Right. So this is a slightly more, I don't want to say sophisticated, but more detached grasp of a situation on the part of an animal. So here, the animal is responding not to one specific perceptual situation of like the worm in front of me or whatever, but instead is grasping something as a sign of something else or a signal for something else. So like in the example of the chickens that are faced with the two different piles of grain, the chicken eventually learns to recognize that the light-colored grain, or I forget which one of the sort of, I think the light-colored one is the good one, and it is capable of responding to the light-colored one even when the actual pairs of colors are switched. So that what was the dark colored grain is now the light colored one in the pair. So here, the chicken is not learning like a very specific response to a particular situation. The chicken learns a more abstract quality of light color versus dark color, and responds to this difference of color in terms of eating from one pile of grain versus the other. And then there's some more complicated discussion about like how rats navigating a maze learn which path is the good one and which one is the one that leads to an electric shock and so on. I don't think the details are that important here, but the idea is that when these rats are learning to navigate a maze, they don't just learn a very specific pattern of motor behavior of like moving your foot so many degrees to the right at this point of the maze and so on. What they learn instead is sort of a structure of the maze that like this direction leads to an electric shock, and so I'm not going to go down this path. This sort of more general structure is what the animal learns. So so these types of forms, these amovable forms, allow for the animal to sort of recognize a signal that either leads to a reward or to a punishment or some sort of situation that is relevant to the animal's life. It can recognize a signal independently of a specific situation, and then it can respond to that signal in a way that allows it to avoid a punishment or find a reward. So these are somewhat more detachable from a specific situation compared to the previous syncretic forms.
This is a really interesting section. So just to kind of confirm my understanding, it's what he's arguing these chickens are understanding is not any, it's not the concrete, it can't be reduced to the concrete situation itself, but it's something like a rule, like this lighter than, or to the lighter, as he puts it. They know that they can get, when they are connected to gray objects, if they go to the lighter one, they'll get better food, which is different from the syncretic forms where maybe an animal bound to the syncretic form wouldn't be able to incorporate this rule into its choice of food and would just kind of go for whatever was closer or sooner, or wouldn't respond, wouldn't adapt when they change up switch the position left and right of the different gray colored food areas, I guess.
Yeah, and so already just the capacity to learn already shows a certain detachment of the behavior from the stimuli that evoke it, right? Because like in the case of the toad, like he points out, the toad just keeps trying to grasp the earthworm, no matter how many times it runs into the glass. It perceives the worm and it performs the behavior of grasping the worm, even though it keeps failing. it doesn't learn that this behavior is not effective in the particular artificial setting of the laboratory. So it's just like sort of it's too sort of closely connected to the perception and the behavior are too closely connected to allow for any sort of learning to occur. And so the fact that the chicken is capable of learning that this arbitrary difference of shades of gray sort of is a signal for better or worse food. This shows that the chicken is not just sort of exhibiting this very strict correspondence between an experience or a perceived object and behavior. Instead, it's sort of sensitive to different qualities of the perceptual situation, and it can sort of identify which ones are reliable signs of something that's relevant to its life, better or worse food or receiving an electric shock or whatever. Here, and again, the different shades of gray are of course completely arbitrary. You could use different illumination, different pitches, or any sensory qualities that the chicken is capable of distinguishing. It can eventually learn. Sometimes it takes more or fewer trials for the chicken to learn a particular sensory difference, but it's capable of learning how to use these sensory qualities as a signal of some sort of aspect of the environment that is relevant to its life. So essentially any aspect of the environment that is capable of perceiving, it can learn to use as a sign of some property of the environment that is useful or harmful to it. So here we see that there's a certain flexibility in the sense that the behavioral response is not tied to one specific perceptual experience, but instead it's capable of being adjusted to respond to the changes in the environment and what types of outcomes happen as it performs certain behavior over time.
That's really interesting. I think he's moving towards a description of symbolic life, and you can kind of see how this is an intermediary form between the example of the toad that can only respond to the concrete situation, and there's something like a sign that isn't completely bound to the concrete situation, which can be abstracted from it. In the case of the chicken, like the lighter than, even if it's not, the sign doesn't have the independence and consistency that language has, for instance. It's kind of intermediary step.
Yeah, and this is what the whole sort of field of animal training relies on, and animals are often capable of responding to extremely subtle and cues that we don't even recognize. Like there's the famous case of Ed the horse from the early 20th century, who was this horse that was sort of taken around to town fairs and stuff as being able to perform arithmetic. So you would say what's 7 plus 5, and then the horse would stomp its foot 12 times or whatever. Eventually, I forget who it was. I know there was a psychologist who figured out that the horse was actually watching the trainer, and it was just sort of stomping its foot a certain number of times until it sort of detected some sort of signal on the trainer's face that the trainer sort of responded in a certain way once the correct number was reached, and then at that point the horse would stop stomping its foot. And so if you asked the horse some arithmetic problem that the trainer didn't know the answer to, then the horse was incapable of responding. But I think in that case there was no evidence that the trainer was sort of deliberately perpetuating a fraud and sort of deliberately treating the horse to do this. It's just that the horse was capable of sort of detecting some subtle sign on the trainer's face that sort of indicated that this was the correct number. Yeah, I don't know if they ever got Ed to solve an integral or differentiate an equation or whatever. So the horse is responding to this very subtle cue of facial features on the trainer that other people probably wouldn't even recognize, and the trainer had no idea that he was doing this. But the animal, through many trials and sort of the general like affective relationship of the horse and the trainer, sort of learns to respond to this very subtle cue and perform this fairly arbitrary behavior of tapping its foot. So this shows like, I mean, horses are relatively sophisticated animals in a lot of ways, but it's like it's this very flexible learning capacity to obviously horses in their sort of evolutionary history had no reason to like be adapted to recognizing human facial expressions. So this is like a fairly recent development in horse evolution. And this tapping your foot a certain number of times is completely like unnatural behavior for horses. So it again there's no like evolutionary reason why it would respond to human facial expressions, with a particular number of foot taps and so on. But the horse is capable, through this learning process of associating a particular facial feature with a certain sequence of foot taps, and then it's capable of learning this like arbitrary behavior in response to this very subtle perceptual cue, so like any like all sorts of circus animals or animals that perform in movies and so on, like they're capable of learning all these weird and sort of arbitrary behaviors as a result of this much greater flexibility of behavior compared to the toad that always tries to grasp the earthworm no matter how many times it fails. Yeah, this kind of learning sometimes also like leads to problems as well. Like anyone who has a pet, I'm sure you've learned that the pet can figure out like I don't know, it's dinner time because like this particular light is on or whatever. Like they learn these like patterns of associations that you would never think of. And then they sort of expect a certain behavior on your part when this particular pattern is exhibited, or like they can figure out when the suitcase comes out, that means the person is leaving, and so therefore I'm going to like eat their shoe or whatever. So like there's like all sorts of subtle patterns that these animals are capable of learning that you might not expect. They don't have any sort of natural relationship to like a dog's sort of evolved capacities to respond to the pre-domestication environment or whatever. But they just like learn these patterns through observing multiple repetitions, sometimes even just a few repetitions, and like their sort of general affective relationship to the owner. So there's like this very subtle learning capacity that can sometimes be a problem for people that want to ensure that in some cases it would be better if the dog wasn't capable of learning these patterns, like in terms of controlling the dog's behavior, for example. But sometimes we can't help training them sort of despite our best interests. And I think I might have mentioned this before as well, but this is also sort of a difficulty when it comes to designing experiments with in animal psychology, because like in the case of humans, you can just ask them like, is this circle bigger or smaller than the other one or whatever. But obviously when you're like doing experiments with dogs or rats or whatever, you can't just ask them what they see or press this button if you see whatever. You have to train them to respond to a situation. But you never know for sure that they're actually responding to whatever aspect of the situation you are interested in. They might be like, if you are interested in whether the dog can tell the difference in size between the circles, the dog might actually be responding to like the overall illumination of the display as opposed to the size of the circle, or some other property of the situation that you never would have considered to be important. And so these like flexible and subtle learning capacity, and the dog could even be responding to the experimenter as opposed to the display. So like all these different elements of the situation that the dog is capable of learning to respond to, you have to sort of guess and try to figure out like how to control these other aspects, like to isolate the one aspect that you're interested in, and like prevent the dog from being able to learn the patterns of the situation that you don't want it to learn, and like when you're trying to isolate one particular pattern. And so yeah, sometimes it's not obvious like how to perform that isolation. You have to like try the experiment and then learn about like the dog is actually responding to some other property of the situation, and then control that property, and sort of through trial and error, then you eventually learn how to isolate the one pattern you're interested in. Yeah, and yeah, so Bats has pointed out here in the chat that yeah, so this is also the case with humans, that we don't necessarily know what it is about a situation that we're responding to, even if we think that it's the size of the size of the circles that we're responding to. It could be some other property of the situation. And yes, this is definitely true in different like experimental settings. You can try to identify what aspect of the situation it is that you're responding to. Again, you'd have to use like similar types of setup as with a dog, where you have to sort of try to control each of these different elements of the situation independently of each other. And yeah, so sometimes it might be surprising, like something that you think is relevant turns out not to be relevant, and some other aspect of the situation that you never would have thought of turns out to be more relevant than you had imagined. But yeah, it's at least easier in the case of humans to like ask them to describe a situation. Like you can just sort of tell them what the task is, as opposed to sort of arduously training them to recognize over sometimes many hundreds of trials to respond to a difference. But you can't necessarily take at face value what the experimental subjects tell you, that like this circle is bigger or not. You can use that as like a piece of information to like analyze, but you can't like sort of treat that as necessarily correct. Okay, let's go on to the next bit from page 108. If we can get a volunteer. Everyone's quiet today.
I can read, I think. Give me a sec. I got a...
Yeah, so we're right at the top of page 108 when you're ready.
Yeah, okay. Although, can you hear me well right now?
Yes, it's good.
Okay, nice. Although taken in itself, the relation of the signal and that which it quote-unquote announces is simple, it is encountered in otherwise slightly differentiated behavior. All degrees of complexity are observed in the structure of the signal, and the nature of the signals to which a species responds can serve as a measure of the quote-unquote intelligence. Domestic chickens, accustomed to choosing the smaller of two figures, treats as smaller than one of Jastrow's equal figures, which appears smaller in human perception because of its position, figure 1. Even if it could be said that the contrast between two grays is contained in the colors as physical stimuli, here at least the differential behavior could not be elicited by the physical stimuli, since objectively the two figures are equal. On the other hand, it is difficult to see what empirical connections would explain it. Nothing would be gained by saying that the convex part of the lower segment is rendered different from the corresponding part of the upper segment by the nearness of a concavity. This would be precisely to recognize that the adequate stimulus is not found in the objects, nor in the objective relations of the physical world, but in another universe where local properties depend on ensemble. A countertest is possible. An animal trained to choose a black object will respond positively even when the object is presented under conditions of extreme illumination, in which it reflects 1,000 times more light than the objects employed during training. If we restrict ourselves to the physical phenomenon, to the light effectively received by the eye of the animal, the constancy of its behavior is even less intelligible, since, under other conditions, a difference of 2% in the stimulation will be sufficient to suspend the acquired reaction. But the power of adapting to the structure of signals, rather than to their material properties, is not without limit in animals. If 8 similar boxes are placed in front of a child at increasing distances from him, and if, without his seeing it, a piece of chocolate is placed in turn in the first, then in the second, then in the third, etc. From the second trial on, the child will systematically look for the goal, not in the box where he just found it, but in the next one. The lower monkeys fail. Perhaps they could be trained to visit each of the boxes in turn, but this is not the proper object of our experiment, since a training of this kind could consist in creating inhibitions with respect to each box yes visited. It would not exclude the hypothesis of an individual action of each of these stimuli, the sign of which would be reversed only as the experiment unfolds, or again the possibility that each of the boxes visited would act, for example, as a positive stimulus, then as inhibiting, in terms of the relations of position which exist between them and all the others, and its place in the sequence of executed operations. There will be no progress throughout a series, but the same monotonous operation begun again with respect to each one, a concrete reaction which depends only on isolated and individual stimulus, or an abstract reaction which treats them all in the same manner, because of the real parts which they have in common. In either case, the training would not be a reaction to order. On the contrary, in the child who has learned the appropriate movements from the second trial on, the generality of the reaction can result neither from an addition of particular reflexes nor from organic equipment, which would abstract from its stimulus that which makes it identical to the preceding ones. The first interpretation would be possible only if the entire series of boxes had been run through at least once. The second, only if a sufficient number of experiences have, by interplay of appropriate inhibitions, permitted disengaging the positive reactions from the ties which it can have with the particular characteristics of each box, in order to make it depend upon their common characteristics, and still it would not permit us to understand how the boxes are visited in the order of their increasing distances. Indeed, it is this order which must be explained above all. The adequate stimulus of this reaction consists in a constant relation which unites the next stimulus and the preceding one, the box to be visited and the box visited, which relation we express by saying that it is necessary, quote-unquote, to always take the next one. This relation is invariable in itself, but its point of application is different in each new trial, and it will be useless without it. This is to say that the adequate stimulus is defined by a double reference to the spatial order, on the one hand, and the order of executed operations on the other. A reaction of these two relations is not abstract, since they take on a singular value in its case, nor is it a reaction to that which is individual in its box, since it is the order of the ensemble which confers on its value as a positive stimulus. The success of the child and the failure of the monkey in this experiment manifests the aptitude in the first and the inability in the second of a disengagement from the elementary structure, which confers a positive reflexogenic value on the place where the goal was attained, in order to be open to a more complex structure in which the reflexogenic value is distributed in terms of space and time.
Right. So maybe just a quick sort of recap of the experiments that he's describing here, or the set of experiments. So the idea is that you have a set of boxes. I think he said 8 boxes in front of a child, and then you do the same type of experiment with a monkey. And on the first trial, there's a chocolate or some food reward hidden in the first box. On the second trial, the food is hidden in the second box. On the third, in the third box, etc. And so the child, I mean, he doesn't say how old this child is, but say like a 5-year-old or whatever, learns pretty quickly how to, what the pattern is, that on each trial you go to the next box, whereas the monkey in this situation keeps going back to the same box where it found the reward on the last trial. So like on the first trial, it finds it in the first box, and then on the second trial, it goes back to the first box again, and only then goes on to the second box, and so on. So here we see that the child is capable of learning a more abstract pattern than the monkey was, and it's capable of learning this pattern not through like multiple repetitions of this trial, but like it sort of grasps it very quickly, just from like already by the second or third box, it already figures out that the pattern is the food is in the next box each time we run through this experiment. And so you can think of like, I don't know, trying to teach a child to count or something like that. Like these kinds of structured situations, sort of abstract patterns, obviously takes a certain amount of practice and everything, but the child still learns it very quickly compared to like you can imagine trying to teach a dog how to count, obviously not spoken words, but like pressing buttons or whatever, is much more, it would take many, many trials before you could get the dog to perform something like sort of similar to the behavior of counting on the part of a child that the child can learn relatively easily. So like these capacities that these animals exhibit to sort of respond to different patterns in a situation are not sort of it's not the case that any animal can learn any pattern. There are sort of limits to the capacities of different animals in terms of what types of patterns they can recognize, how much they can abstract from a certain situation. So in some situations, it seems like the animals are sort of too affectively bound up with the situation to perform this kind of abstraction. So like the sort of pull of the draw of the reward is so strong that the animal can't like sort of disengage itself from it and respond to some sort of more abstract pattern. It's just sort of like fixated on the goal, and it can't like figure out what the pattern is that would actually allow it to achieve that goal. I think one of the Simondon readings that we did, he talked about how like a cat is capable of navigating a maze where it has to go around a sort of spiral pattern towards the center and reach a food reward in the middle of the maze. But if you sort of reverse the pattern, so the cat is at the center and the food is on the outside, the cat is not able to sort of navigate the spiral. In the first instance, with the food at the center, the spiral leads to a constantly decreasing divergence away from the goal. So the cat is sort of, even though it has to temporarily move away from the center as it navigates around the spiral, each turn of the spiral reduces the distance, and so the cat sort of is capable of grasping that it's actually getting closer to the goal. Whereas in the opposite configuration, where the cat is in the middle and the food is on the outside, the cat has to get further and further away at each turn of the spiral, and it's sort of the attraction towards the food is sort of overpowers its capacity to figure out the configuration of the maze, and so it sort of gets stuck at the point of the spiral that's closest to the food at each turn, and it can't like sort of bring itself to move away from the food and engage in a longer detour at each turn of the spiral until it eventually gets out of the maze. And so here, we see that the cat is not capable of grasping the sort of abstract pattern, but it's in part because of the affective draw of the food is so strong that it can't like sort of detach itself from the specifics of the situation. And so obviously many animals are capable of exhibiting very sophisticated, very subtle learning, learning these patterns and so on. But at the same time, these capacities are not limitless. Certain animals will not be able to perform certain learning tasks that other animals, like human infants, for example, are capable of learning. There's like, and it will depend for each animal on like what the relationship is between this task and its sort of natural life setting and behaviors and so on. This is like kind of an inversion of like the sort of Pavlov conditioned reflex account, because here learning is understood here not as like how do we take these two isolated elements like the stimulus and the response, how do we connect these two things that were previously isolated. Now learning is understood as how do we actually separate things that are normally sort of bound together. So like in the sort of natural setting of a chicken, the color, the illumination, the sounds, etc., all these things are all going to be bound together. And in terms of like what situation is likely to contain food or the preferred type of food or whatever. But then in this artificial laboratory setting where the shade of gray is sort of the sort of specific signal that indicates preferred or less preferred food, the chicken is capable of sort of abstracting away from all the other irrelevant aspects of the situation and focusing on the shade of gray. And so it can separate out this one aspect of the situation that is relevant in this experimental setting and learn the pattern. whereas maybe other animals would not be able to perform this kind, like the toad example. The toad probably can't learn how to do this, no matter how many trials you put it through. But then if you put the chicken in a different type of setting, it might not be able, like, this sequence of boxes. The chicken probably can't learn how to find the food in the third box on the third trial, and the fourth box on the fourth trial, and etc. So like, yeah, different types of situations, and different degrees of abstraction, like are possible for different animals depending on what their normal behavioral capacities are, what types of perceptual relationships they have to different situations, and so on. But yeah, so we want to understand. So here we're understanding learning in terms of like how much can the animal separate itself from its sort of normal setting and treat some isolated aspect of the situation as a signal for some property of the environment that is relevant to its life. Okay, so let's go on to the bottom of page 109 from Thus the Objective. If I can get a volunteer.
I can read. Thus, the objective description of behavior uncovers in it a more or less articulated structure, a more or less rich interior signification in reference to quote-unquote situations, which are sometimes individual, sometimes abstract, and sometimes essential. The same variety would be noticed if we were to consider modes of behavior in themselves more quote-unquote difficult and more quote-unquote integrated than elementary signal behavior, in which the conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus, instead of being simply contiguous, present a relation which we would call logical or objective. From then on, the conditioned stimulus gives rise to special relations which are more and more clearly distinguished from reactions to the goal. In human language, one can say that it becomes the means to a certain end. The first example of behavior of this kind is furnished by cases in which the stimulus becomes reflexogenic as a direct result of its spatial or temporal relations with the goal. If a dog is placed in front of a trellis with only two openings, and if behind the trellis at the level of the first opening one arranges a mobile goal which moves along the trellis toward the second opening, the dog always runs toward the spot where the goal was initially placed on the first trials. In the course of later experiments, it follows the goal in its movements along the trellis and grasps it at the moment when it is the level of the second opening. Finally, the dog will go directly toward the second opening, where it will proceed and wait for the goal. If it were accepted that the second opening of the trellis has become the conditioned stimulus of the animal's reactions, the stimulus would not be able to overcome the action of the unconditioned stimulus, which is in competition with it, since it borrows all its power from the latter, then one would not explain why the dog leaves its bait in order to go and wait for it at a point where it is not yet. Thus, the goal must cease to be defined by the stimulations which it exercises here and now on the animal, and be integrated into the spatial and temporal structures which mediate it, which bind together its present position, the opening of the trellis, and the point where the dog is stationed. We can see a substitution of this kind in another of Buitendieck's experiments. Buitendieck asked himself what the behavior of a rat would be if it had to choose between a path which goes in the direction of the goal at the beginning. Tolman's experiments had shown that with equal distance, this path is preferred, and a second path which deviates from it at first, but is found to be the shorter. The experiment shows that the simple structure, direction of the goal, direction of the path, can, in the rat, be displaced by a more complex structure in which the length of the path enters in. 6 rats into the apparatus first try to reach the goal directly and are stopped by the glass barrier G, then take path AEDZ of their own accord. When they have completed the course, they are conducted by the shorter path ABCZ. A first crucial experiment is then instituted. The animals are put at A and left free. 5 of them take the longer path, the initial elements of which are in the direction of the goal. The 6th starts along this way, then retraces its steps and takes the path ABCZ. But if the animals are put back at point A several times, by the end of the first day, 5 trials, 2 of the 4 remaining rats choose the shorter path. The second day, on the 6th trial, the 2 others also choose it. In order to eliminate the influence of habit, the animal is conducted along the longer path after each correct choice. In order to establish that it is not a question of conditioned reaction to the right and left, animals are placed in a new apparatus, which is a mirror image of the preceding one. These precautions do not change the result, which remains in favor of the shorter path. Will it be contended that the, quote, path which goes in the direction of the goal, unquote, has become inhibiting as a consequence of the first trials? But it has never given rise to failure. At the most, it could be said that it leads to the goal less quickly. Is this circumstance sufficient for creating an inhibition? If one accepts this, one recognizes that the conditioned stimulus is not a real element of the physical world, but a relation, the temporal structure. And we shall see that in reality, the intervention of spatial structure as such is much more probable. Further experiments show that spatial structures are much more precise than temporal structures in the behavior of the rat. If one uses a labyrinth in which movable partitions permit varying the path which the animal must traverse in order to gain the exit, and if the open path sometimes involves 2 turns to the left, sometimes 2 turns to the right, the animal can be trained in 2 series of experiments to traverse each of these 2 paths without false movement. But the alteration of these 2 patterns of behavior, which we will indicate by the symbols LLRR, is not successfully obtained. If the animal is now placed in a longer labyrinth, which requires the same alternation from the entrance to the exit, the training succeeds. Since care was taken to eliminate every other factor, the difference in behavior can only be the result of the difference in structure, which in the first case are ordered with relation to time, in the second case with relation to space. The same sequences of movement are possible or impossible depending on whether they are developed along an open space or whether they only succeed one another in time. What is achievable in the unity of an action, which is continuous through space, is no longer achievable if it is a question of several cycle movements connected in time. The living body does not organize space indifferently. The one is not available to it in the same way as the other. Nothing is more appropriate for manifesting the insufficiency of Pavlov's views. The spatial labyrinth and the temporal labyrinth are indiscernible from his point of view. And one could say that for him, there are only temporal labyrinths. Yeah, I don't know. I find some of these experiments, like I don't really understand the dog and trellis, the structure of the dog and trellis experiment, but I get the idea that there's an abstraction, immediate location of the goal, which the dog is able to learn in order to move to a spot that is further away and receive the treat or whatever it wants by moving further away from where it thinks it is.
Yeah, I think that's sort of the like general message that we're supposed to learn from these examples. So like the problem for a sort of straightforward behaviorist account is that this dog and trellis example, so you have a trellis where the dog can see the goal that it, piece of food or whatever that it wants to get, and then there's one opening that is where the food is at the first part of the trial, and then the food moves along the path of the trellis until it reaches the second opening. And the dog first tries to go to the closest opening and misses the food. And then after other trials, it will start to follow the food as it moves along the trellis. And then finally, it learns to go right to the end where the second opening is and wait for the food to arrive. And so the problem here is that on like a sort of straightforward behaviorist account, the dog has to somehow learn to move away from the food to go to the second opening, as opposed to going to where the food is, which is what it should be sort of conditioned to do. And so like this is like sort of a very simple version of like some of these other experiments, but like in general we find that animals are capable of learning not just to respond directly to the stimuli that they encounter, but something more abstract, like the structure of a maze, for example. Like in the case of these rats that after a few trials learn to find the shorter path in the maze. So like in this example, the longer path can't be inhibited because it always leads to success in any case. Like both paths lead to the food at the end of the maze. So the longer path is not inhibited, but the rats still actually end up learning the shorter path. So somehow they're capable of grasping not just, this path leads to food, but this path, it leads to food faster than the other path. So yeah, they learn this sort of sort of spatial orientation of the maze. And then the last one, the experiment that he mentions here is or sort of set of experiments is you train the rats to learn how to get out of a maze by either turning left twice or turning right twice. And they learn both of these sets of mazes, so left, left, or right, right. And then you give them a sequence of mazes that alternate between left and right. So you give them a left, left maze, and then a right, right maze, and then a left, left, etc. And it turns out that the rats are not capable of learning the alternation pattern. So they have to figure out each time whether this is a left, left maze or a right, right maze. But if instead you give them a maze that's twice the length, that they first have to turn left twice and then have to turn right twice, after a few trials, they learned how to navigate this double length maze with the same sequence of movements of turning left twice and then turning right twice that they were incapable of learning before. And so what this shows, according to Merleau Ponty, is that what the rat is learning is not just a sequence of movements of turn left twice and then turn right twice. Instead, it's learning a structure of a maze. It's learning a spatial structure that it understands how to navigate. And so in the one case, it learns turn left twice and there's the exit, and then it learns turn right twice and there's the exit. And then it's incapable of sort of figuring out that these two mazes are sort of in a temporal sequence with each other. And then the second, and then the second sequence, it learns turn left twice, then turn right twice, and there's the exit. And it learns the whole spatial structure as opposed to a temporal structure of two mazes in sequence. So there's a difference from the rat's perspective between a temporal sequence of two mazes and a spatial orientation that the rat has to navigate using the same sequence of movements. So it's learning a spatial structure. It's capable of learning a spatial structure and not a temporal structure, even though the sequence of movements that it has to execute to navigate these two mazes are actually the same. Right. And so he points out here that this is sort of contrary to the whole Pavlov perspective on animal behavior, because for Pavlov, essentially these two situations should be the same from the perspective of the rat. The rat, everything should be just a temporal sequence of behaviors in response to specific stimuli for the rat. And so the fact that the rat is capable of learning one maze and not the other, or learning the longer maze and not the sequence of two mazes, suggests that the rat is actually grasping the spatial structure of the longer maze as opposed to the temporal structure of a sequence of two mazes. So what the rat is learning is not just a sequence of movements in response to specific stimuli, but a more abstract understanding of the spatial structure of the situation. And so this is a very different type of learning than just sort of conjoining one stimulus with a certain behavioral response. Right. Okay. So let's go on to the next bit. I can read this one. I think this will be our last one probably for today. Okay. Right. But at the same time, these experiments put us on our guard against another error, which is symmetrical with and the inverse of Pavlov's. The terms, quote, space and, quote, time should not be taken here in their human meaning, according to which relations of time can be symbolized by relations of space. This spatio-temporal correspondence does not exist for animal behavior, and space is, as it were, a more solid and more manipulable structure than time. One would find something analogous in man at the properly perceptual level in which the dimensions of space and time interfere. The privilege of space in animals in the presence of a sort of space-time in perceptual behavior presents the same difficulty to the philosopher. In both cases, it is a question of explicitating modes of behavior or experience which present themselves as original without deforming them by an intellectualist interpretation. The temporal relations which play a role in animal behavior manifest quote-unquote adhesions, and something like a viscosity of which it is difficult for us to conceive on the basis of pure and manipulable concepts of space and time. The relations of means to end can still be subtended by mechanical and static structures. They represent a higher degree of integration since they seem to play no role in the behavior of dogs, which, as we have just seen, adapt themselves to the relations of space. If a piece of meat is placed on a box with one end of a string tied around the meat and the other end hanging to the ground, dogs do not learn to pull the morsel of meat toward them as long as they limit themselves to looking. They must make it fall fortuitously by playing with the string. A dog observed by Köhler, one which in other experiments has shown itself to be very quote-unquote intelligent, multiplied reactions to the goal but tried nothing with the string which was placed in front of it. Cats acquire an adaptive behavior only if the string is rubbed with a piece of fish. On the other hand, lower monkeys and even more so chimpanzees seem capable of adapted reactions to mechanical and static relations as such. There is no point in describing the well-known experiment in the course of which one of Köhler's chimpanzees adapted a bamboo stick of small diameter to one of larger diameter and used the instrument to reach a goal which was not directly accessible. One would only like to insist upon the role which could have been played by the fortuitous position of the bamboo sticks in the hands of the animal in the moment which preceded his discovery. It can be established that it was the favorable occasion, perhaps even the necessary occasion, but not the cause of the learning. If, as a matter of fact, one makes use of 4 tubes of increasing diameters, with the difference from one to the other being constant, and presents the 3 possible pairs one after the other to the animal, in such a way that the same tube is in one case the larger and in another the smaller of the two, one observes that the reaction of the animal is not acquired with respect to each tube considered individually. In fact, from the first manipulations of this kind on, it was observed that it was always the thinner of the 2 rods which is pushed toward the other, and consequently that the animal always grasps it in the right hand, which is more adroit, the other rod being held passively in the left hand. But during the course of the second series of experiments which we are describing, whether the thinner or the thicker tube was closer. In 8 cases out of 12, the monkey grasped the thicker tube with the left hand and the thinner one with the right. In 4 other trials, the animal re-established the normal distribution of the tubes as soon as it had them in hand, without any groping, even before trying to bring them together. Thus, the assembling reaction is in no way tied to the absolute properties of each one of the tubes. It is regulated at each moment by the relation of their diameters. Since it is this relation which the animal has learned to take into consideration, one must therefore suppose that it played a decisive role as such in the course of the initial experiment. But it is rather generally accepted that the behavior of chimpanzees goes beyond the level of the conditioned reflex adapted to individual stimuli. For us, it is of more value to note the lacunae and the insufficiency of mechanical and static relations. There is something artificial in the descriptions of behavior which we have given up to now. By soliciting reactions to geometric and physical relations from the animal, one gives the impression that they are the natural framework of his behavior, just as, for man, they are constitutive of the world. In reality, before they find access to animal behavior, other more natural structures have to be broken up. They emerge from ensembles which are difficult to disassociate. Let us recall Köhler's experiment in which a chimpanzee which has already utilized the rods is left alone in its cage in the presence of an inaccessible goal and a dried bush from which the branches can easily be cut. The results are very unequal with different subjects, and in any case, a solution never comes about except after a long phase of inactivity. The tree branch as a stimulus is not then the equivalent of a rod, and the spatial and mechanical properties which permit it to assume this function are not immediately accessible to animal behavior. One of Köhler's subjects, which had nevertheless learned to manipulate cases in preceding experiments, does not use one which is offered it as long as another monkey is sitting on it. It leans against it, thus it cannot be said that it has not seen it, but it remains for him a means of support or rest. It cannot become an instrument. Thus, mechanical structures can become reflexogenic only if stronger structures, which assign a useful value to objects, are first reorganized. The constant error of empiricist and intellectualist psychologists is to reason as if a tree branch, since as a physical reality, it has in itself the properties of length, breadth, and rigidity, which will make it usable as a rod, also possesses these characteristics as a stimulus, and so much so that their intervention in behavior would follow automatically. What is not seen is that the field of animal activity is not made up of physical geometric relations, as our world is. These relations are not virtually present in the stimuli, and it is not a simple abstraction which makes them appear in the regulation of behavior. They presuppose a positive and novel, quote-unquote, structuration of the situation. It should not be astonishing, then, if the physical geometric relations, which are scarcely disengaged from stronger biological connections, are readily overlaid by the latter, or even if they never appear in a pure state. In lower monkeys, a rod or a rake is employed as an instrument only if it is arranged ahead of time in an appropriate way. If, for example, the rake is already placed behind the fruit and its handle within reach of the hand. Something analogous is noted in less intelligent chimpanzees, which, in the first experiment at least, employ the rod only if it is in, quote, optical contact, unquote, with the goal. That is, if the goal and the rod can be encompassed in a single glance. The instrumental value of an object decreases to the extent that it is more removed from the goal, which is to say that it is not made up of precise mechanical properties which would be independent of its position. Even when the chimpanzee succeeds in extending its field of action in time as well as space, as when it goes toward a final goal while passing by several intermediate ones. It often happens that the principal goal, which is too close, attracts to itself the operations which were addressed to the secondary goal. This, quote, short circuit phenomenon shows that the chimpanzee does not succeed in developing in an indifferent space and time a mode of behavior regulated by the objective properties of the instrument, that it is always exposed to the solicitation of the near future or of the spatial proximity, which contracts or dislocates the structure of the action. Even in the cases where the chimpanzee utilizes mechanical connections, it is probable that they do not influence its behavior by means of the properties which human perception ascribes to them. If chimpanzees are presented with several cords which all go toward a goal, but only one of which is attached to the fruit, they grasp any one just as often as the others. Their behavior is not governed by the mechanical relation of the cord to the goal. It depends much more on the length of the cords presented, the shorter being most frequently chosen. Yeah, this is a mega paragraph. Let's stop here actually. So again, this has to do with the animal's capacity to grasp structures of different perceptual situations, and how this varies, depending on the animal, depending on what type of situation it is. So in the case of these bamboo rods, so the chimpanzee is capable of grasping that the thinner rod fits inside the thicker one, and it picks up the thin rod with its right hand, which is more skilled and sort of has better fine motor skills, just like in humans or in most humans. So it picks up the thin rod with its right hand and the thicker rod in its left hand, and it moves the thin rod in the right hand towards the thick rod in the left hand. So it inserts the thin rod in the thick one. The same type of movement that we would perform in a similar situation. So here the chimpanzee is capable of grasping the sort of spatial relationship of one rod fitting in another and of the movement that is required to stick one into the other. But other sort of learning processes, in other situations, the chimpanzee is not capable of sort of grasping an abstract structure. So in the case of the cage where there's a dead bush, that the chimpanzee can easily break the branches off of and use those branches to grasp something. The chimpanzee doesn't sort of figure out that it can do this. It doesn't sort of recognize that these tree branches or these branches of a bush, could potentially serve as a grasping mechanism. It just doesn't sort of perceive this property of these branches. And likewise, in these other experiments, even if you give it like a rake or some other sort of tool that it could use to grasp the object that's out of reach, it only recognizes that if the object and the tool are actually like close enough to each other that it can see them together in one glance. So it doesn't sort of see, like if you have the fruit or whatever that's trying to reach on one side of the cage and the rake on the other side, it doesn't sort of put these two elements together and figure out, if I go over here and grab the rake, then I can get the fruit. It only sort of understands the capacity of using the rake to grasp the fruit if it actually sees the two in conjunction with each other. So here, like, this is something that obviously a human in this setting would quickly be able to figure out. So there's a certain capacity for separating things out and grasping their properties that humans possess, that even chimpanzees in this case don't possess. So again, there's very subtle, very sophisticated learning capacity in many animals, but it's not necessarily sort of unlimited in terms of how much it can abstract away from the specifics of a situation. So the chimpanzee can't sort of abstract from the bush structure and grasp the parts of the bush as potential grasping objects. It just sort of treats the bush as this sort of annoying obstacle in its cage. It doesn't really it doesn't grasp the bush as a potential source of tools to use to manipulate other objects.
I thought this footnote that I put in the chat was interesting. Footnote 173. The sentence was, "What is not seen is that the field of animal activity is not made up of physicogeometric relations as our world is. And then the footnote says it must be added that our world is not constantly made up of, which is pretty strongly phenomenological position. Kind of sounds like Heidegger. And maybe one way to understand what he's saying here is that there's a kind of readiness to hand of the world of the chimpanzee, which is difficult and probably impossible for us to imagine. And there's a tendency to kind of transpose, I guess, the more theoretical mode of projection of the researcher onto the animal being studied.
Yeah, that's a good point. So like the chimpanzee in the cage can sort of grasp the rake as a tool for reaching the fruit that's outside the cage or whatever. It can grasp this when they're like close enough to each other or when the perceptual situation is right. But when it sees the bush, it only perceives the bush as like a potential obstacle or as something sort of like tied to a particular behavioral repertoire. It can't sort of abstract from that behavioral response to the bush and sort of investigate the properties of like the branches of the bush and then figure out, the bush branches are, long and rigid and would be suitable for reaching distant objects. It can't sort of separate the properties of these elements of its situation and then sort of figure out how they could be used to achieve certain goals. Whereas, of course, humans, even when we're like, sort of absorbed in a situation, the way that in the types of manipulations of objects that Heidegger points out, like, using a hammer or whatever, at the same time, you're still capable of sort of, grasping, like, is this the right hammer for this job? Is it too heavy or too light or whatever? You can still, or if you can't find your hammer, you can sort of pick up some other object and sort of use it as a hammer. If it has the right sort of, if it's like relatively heavy and solid, as opposed to like, I don't know, a piece of jello or whatever, you would sort of, recognize what properties of objects make them suitable to perform certain tasks, even if it's not like the normal use of that object, or even if you've never seen that object before, you can still like sort of recognize certain properties that the object has and then figure out how to use those properties to manipulate your environment in whatever desired way. And so, like, yeah, this capacity to sort of separate yourself from the immediate engagement with the objects and sort of recognize their properties and figure out how to use those properties is a kind of disengagement from an immediate relation to the world that these chimpanzees don't seem to have. So like, this is what he's talking about here in terms of like physical geometric relations. So you can, as a human, you can look at the bush and sort of investigate like the properties of the branches, and then figure out whether those properties are going to be useful to you in some other way. Whereas the chimpanzee just sees like this annoying thing stuck in the middle of my cage that I have to walk around. It doesn't really recognize it as having properties that could potentially be used for some other purpose. Okay, so let's stop here for today because I have to get to another meeting. So we'll pick up from the top of 115 in this multi-page paragraph that we are familiar with from our Simondon reading. But I think this might be the first of these that we come across in Merleau Ponty. It should be good for next week. Hopefully I can get all my schoolwork done in time. Let's meet up again next week. Okay, thanks everyone.
That sounds good. Thanks, Nan. Thanks, everyone.